scomodissimo. Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone. President FICO, Prime Minister Draghi, Speaker Pelosi, President PACHECO, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure and an honor for me to welcome you in Italy's Senate for the opening session of the Parliamentary Speaker Summit of the G20 countries, organized together with my colleague Roberto Fico, who is the President of the Chamber of Deputies, whom I wish to thank for his commitment. Cooperation with him was perfect, as was also perfect the cooperation with the national delegations. Together, we analyzed and defined over the past few weeks all of the documents and the contents which make up the contribution of the various parliaments, which go hand in hand with those of the G20 governments. And I'm especially pleased to be able to hold this event mostly in presence. After so much time, we now have the possibility of meeting one another. And I am sure that this exchange of ideas will be very tangible, it will be fruitful, and also pleasant. I wish to thank all of you, dear colleagues, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for having traveled at length for many of you. And I also wish to thank all of the colleagues who are attending our meeting today through our video conference function. The priorities of the Italian presidency of the G20 have been interpreted through three words: people, planet, and prosperity, the famous three Ps. And to those three Ps, we decided to add a fourth P, the letter with which the word parliaments begins, as a way of underscoring the importance of our parliamentary activities, the importance of the dialogue between lawmakers, and we wish to focus on the added value which is offered by the contribution of parliaments to the G20 process. G20 countries represent 60% of the world's population, 80% of global wealth, and 75% of international trade. The convergences which take place within the G20, in fact, are important for the entire world, which means that we lawmakers have a major responsibility, given the fact that all of our parliaments, in line with each of our constitutional traditions, represent representation, democracy, and the debate upon which the international commitment of our governments is based. Over the past year and a half, parliamentary assemblies, parliamentary services have searched for ways and often found ways, despite the pandemic, to never stop their activities. And we have guaranteed the continuity of our work, both in terms of discussing laws and in terms of monitoring and being vigilant. And I'm sure that Prime Minister Draghi, who I wish to greet and thank for, and I wish to thank him for being with us today, will be able to take stock of the guidance and the ideas expressed by our debate in view of the upcoming Summit of Heads of State and Governments. There can be no global challenge in terms of economic development, in terms of environmental and human development and sustainability, in terms of social development, in terms of safeguarding the ecosystem and reducing inequalities, which hasn't been impacted and in fact worsened by the pandemic, with a major burden on our lives and our communities. We have touched with our own hands the risks brought about by an interconnected world. The pandemic has been a marking point, a turning point in history, and compared to early 2020, a little over a year and a half ago, we can say now that nothing will ever be the same again. In many countries, the pandemic emergency still hasn't been overcome, and there are far too many people who continue to become ill with COVID. Since the beginning of 2020, there have been over 235 million people who have been affected by COVID and unfortunately over 5 million or almost 5 million victims. Of course, our thoughts and our embrace are for all of those people and families who have suffered. These are impressive figures. However, they are accompanied increasingly every day by the certainty that we can win this battle. We'll be able to overcome the pandemic thanks to scientific research, progress in healthcare, and the intense vaccination campaign, which is taking place swiftly all over the world. In fact, over 6 billion doses of the vaccine have already been given. This is a race against time, and there can be no hesitation, no uncertainties. We have to trust science. We have to mobilize all of our energies to guarantee health treatment and widespread vaccinations that can reach out to all nations, even the poorest and the least advanced ones. We have to focus on solidarity, and we have to embrace all countries. This is an effort which knows no borders, and we are encouraged by the conclusions of the recent Health G20 summit in Rome. The target is to offer vaccines to 40% of the world's population by year-end, and it is a task within our reach. The pandemic has also revolutionized the economic and social lives of our countries. It has affected jobs, businesses, schools, social relations, the mental health of vast sectors of our population, with a major impact on the elderly and undermining the future of our young generations. It has also affected women especially. Let me say that with a special emphasis. They have been on the front line in this war. It would be, I think, useless to ignore the malaise and the effects, including the political effects, the sense of precariousness, the insecurity that the pandemic has brought about in many advanced societies. And now that we have the scientific and healthcare tools to counter this devastating virus, we have to redefine strategies, plans, and tangible tools to promote a global recovery. Our commitment to relaunch and revitalize the growth of our countries has to go hand in hand with our ability to define a new development model, one that can focus on the human person, so as to fully take advantage of the opportunity offered by innovation and progress, such as the beneficial effects of the digital revolution, a more harmonious relationship with the environment, the resources which stem from knowledge and culture. An integrated vision of the Italian G20's 3 priorities, namely people, planet, and prosperity, is a vision we want to have during our summit as well, with the contribution of all of the colleagues, all of the speakers and presidents, with the experts and representatives of civil society, of the scientific sector, and all of the members of international organizations. Dear colleagues, as you know, in previous weeks, a joint statement has been considered. It has been improved and enriched by the contribution of several national delegations, whom I wish to thank. This will be the trace we will leave following this activity of ours. Only by strengthening and supporting the tools of multilateralism on all levels, and through parliamentary cooperation, will we be able to deal with the responsibility and farsightedness, all of the huge challenges we face. This is a major test for mankind. We have to have a global perspective in mind as we work towards a shared future which can be better for ourselves and especially for the future generations. And in this regard, as President of the Italian Senate, allow me to express my concern for the dramatic crisis in Afghanistan. The Afghan people had benefited from 20 years of social progress and pacification, which is now once again surrounded by instability and chaos. the promises of moderation, unfortunately, have not been fulfilled, as we can see from the events taking place. And I wish to think of the Afghan female members of parliament who have worked for the progress of their country for so many years. For all women, there are dark times ahead. We cannot and must not abandon them. Thank you.
Cedo ora la parola.
I now give the floor to the President of the Chamber of Deputies, Mr. Roberto FICO, with whom I have shared our engagement and also the enthusiasm of organizing this event. Thank you. Dear colleagues, Madam President of the Senate, Mr. President of the Council of Ministers, speakers all, it is my honor to introduce today's conference, and I thank you so much for being present. Together with President CASELLATI in this meeting, we wish to ensure you of our contribution, a qualified contribution, to our assemblies, to the debate and the themes that the Italian presidency has placed at the very core of the G20 at government level. We believe that parliaments should play a role in agreeing and coordinating policies to promote, after the very serious crisis generated by the pandemic, a recovery which is fair, sustainable, inclusive on an economic and social and environmental standpoint. Like the government G20, we have decided to center our conference on three major axes: people, planet, and prosperity, which are on the 2030 agenda of the UN, and also stress that people should be a core objective in our policies and strategies to promote development and guarantee all the conditions that are necessary for a dignified life and leaving no one behind. We need, dear colleagues, to reiterate that we need to concretely act with a commitment, which is a common commitment and a consistent one, to counter hunger and poverty, and also ensure that all human beings, in particular the most fragile categories, have access to hygiene and water and quality education, equal opportunities, training, human development, and finding adequate jobs. All this is part of fundamental freedoms and rights, and they are universal. We cannot tolerate any systemic infringement or discrimination anywhere in the planet. The second axis of the G20 is the planet, and it is an admonishment to us all. We need to have a radical turnabout in our collective and individual behaviors. Otherwise, we will not only compromise the environment, but jeopardize peace and growth in many different areas of society. We're all aware of the fact that a lack of energy, water, disasters, and water and energy resources and climate disasters have an impact on agriculture and impoverish large segments of the population, and also stress inequality. And then all this would undermine social cohesion and our civil and democratic lives. Therefore, we need ambitious and binding commitments at a global level to reduce polluting emissions and act urgently in a transition towards a sustainable economic new model. The European Union, as you know, is at the forefront with really ambitious objectives, and we hope we shall share these objectives with other countries. Tomorrow, there will be another meeting the day after tomorrow, there will be another meeting at the Chamber of Deputies, and I hope that you will all take part. And finally, there is the axis of prosperity. Prosperity means to aim towards a new model of sustainable growth on an economic, social, and environmental plane that can engender growth, jobs, and a better quality of life in all areas of the world. And to do this and to have a lasting well-being and fair well-being for all future generations, we must realize that we must work for prosperity, but we can only but reduce inequality in the different areas of the world and within our countries. We need to realize that there is competition in international markets, and this competition cannot take place by reducing the cost of labor or social protection. And therefore, we need to increase an offer for technology and innovation and move towards a digital revolution in cooperation among all our different countries and in general with the international community. We need to act and to attain our goals. And furthermore, no country can go it alone. We cannot really try to overcome crime problems. We know how many that if we only work for military relations of powers or different groups of powers, we cannot attain our goals. These strategies only lead to armed conflict or trade wars and undermine all our efforts. The parliaments can certainly provide added value to consolidate a new multilateral setup in the different countries. We can start to work for a new diplomatic relation, which is not only the conventional intergovernmental one, and we can also operate to share new stimuli and also be more accessible and provide more access, to citizens. We need to join together as Parliament, and our action is pluralistic. We can contribute to better explaining to public opinion the logic of decision-making, which is difficult and complex, which is entailed by the transition towards a sustainable development. Cooperation among parliaments is in no way secondary to the one between governments. It has its own major potential that we need to tap and we need to work on as from today. And with this, I thank you for attending this important meetings organized by Italian parliaments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Fico. I'd now like to give the floor to the Prime Minister of the Council of Ministers, Mr. Mario Draghi.
President
Elisabetta CASELLATI, President Roberto Fico, President Duarte PACHECO, distinguished delegates, it is a pleasure for me to take the floor during the 7th summit of the G20 parliamentary speakers. I wish to thank President CASELLATI, President Fico, and President PACHECO for their hospitality and for having organized this event. Throughout history, Parliament has always been a driver of economic and civil growth. You have checked the work of governments and found constructive solutions to political clashes. You have mediated between the interests of various groups, workers, entrepreneurs, the young and the elderly. You have reached difficult compromises between freedom and security, between profit and solidarity. You have struggled to allow for progress in our societies, and you have defended the rule of law and fundamental freedoms. We have to be grateful to parliaments for all they have done and for what they continue to do. Your role transcends national borders. You are a bridge between countries. You promote dialogue and cooperation, even in times of conflict. The first multilateral political organization of modern history was an alliance between parliaments, the Inter-parliamentary Union. Its founders and some of its guiding personalities have been awarded 8 Nobel Peace Prizes, thanks to their fundamental contribution to the resolution of international disputes. The IPU has been a major defender of peace and security in the world. It was a precursor to the Society of Nations and to the United Nations. And still to this day, it works to bring about the opportunities to meet between members of parliament, allowing them to work together on international topics ranging from human rights to education. Despite major divisions, parliaments work to promote a dialogue between countries. This is something you do bilaterally, through multilateral assemblies, and through the frequent meetings of the presidents and speakers of parliaments. You cooperate to find common solutions to global issues, such as the need to guarantee a strong economic recovery, and a fair one at that, following the pandemic. Think of climate change. Think of your commitment to improve the condition for women. The pandemic is finally under control in many parts of the world, thanks to effective vaccination campaigns. But COVID-19 continues to have major impacts on many countries. In late September, we still had 50,000 victims per day, despite the huge increase in vaccine production. Such a high number of victims is simply unacceptable. We face 2 problems. In rich countries, vaccine doses are widely available, although a minority of our citizens refuses to accept the vaccine or is hesitant in doing so. And this behavior often stems from the fear of the fact that vaccines are unsafe or ineffective, despite scientific evidence proves that the opposite is true. In low-income countries, the availability of vaccines is still very limited, also due to logistics issues. Around the world, over 5.7 billion doses have been offered, but only 2% of these doses have reached Africa. Parliaments can do a great deal to support the global vaccination effort. You can implement provisions that can strengthen transparency mechanisms in the distribution of vaccines, countering the waste of public funding in the field of healthcare. You can also support governments in their struggle against disinformation on the topic of vaccines. In a recent study published by Nature, the topic of the dissemination of fake news was discussed, and it proves that it reduces the possibility of individuals of vaccinating themselves against COVID-19 by more than 6%. The European Parliament has done a great deal to dissipate fake news regarding vaccines, and has offered guidelines to counter the dissemination of fake news in the social media. The message we convey to our citizens has to be extremely clear. The message is that vaccines are safe. Vaccines save lives. Parliaments have a very important role to play in favoring and bringing about a fair and sustainable recovery. According to the OECD, global economy will grow 5.7% this year and 4.5% next year. However, the recovery is still fragile and it isn't homogeneous. Also due to the different intensity in economic policy responses to the crisis. The advanced economies have been capable of stimulating growth through monetary policies and through robust and effective budget policies. Poor countries and emerging countries have had a lower margin in terms of developing their production fabric. These economic divergences may end up erasing years of progress made in struggling against poverty and against global inequalities. Parliaments have a role to play by promoting policies that can relaunch investments, removing obstacles to growth, and policies that can economically support the more fragile countries. We all have to commit to promote the recovery of the global economy, a long-lasting recovery that leaves no one behind. Parliaments are also at the very core of the global response against climate change. Your prerogatives include that of translating into your national legislation all of the international agreements. You can contribute to ensuring the distribution of funds to support climate policies in a fair and effective way. You can be vigilant on what governments do or on what they do not do to face the climate crisis. G20 countries are responsible for 75% of global emissions. And together, we have to guide the efforts to reduce global emissions and to accelerate the energy transitions. You, parliaments, have to urge us to keep our collective promises in terms of our commitment to limit the increase of temperature to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Unless we act, the climate crisis will worsen, and future generations will judge us, depending on the swiftness and the firmness with which we will be able to respond to this emergency. I also wish to underscore the role parliaments have in countering gender inequalities. Currently, only 25% of the world's members of parliaments are women. This figure has grown constantly in recent years, but it continues to be far too low. Unfortunately, even these forms of progress can be easily erased. The condition of women is a priority as far as the Italian G20 presidency is concerned. Last August, we held the very first G20 ministerial conference on female emancipation. These are only the very first steps we take, and parliaments can help us in this extremely important commitment. You have to continue to focus carefully on gender issues, making sure that women are always at the very core of the legislative process. You have to continue to offer to girls and young women positive role models, to encourage them to have an active role in the political and parliamentary activities of the future. The members of the G20 have a moral duty, not just towards their citizens, but also towards the entire international community. We have to defend women's rights everywhere, especially in those regions in which they are threatened. And I'm thinking of Afghanistan, especially, where women are losing their rights and their freedom. After 20 years, during which the presence of women in Afghanistan's political and parliamentary life was improving, we are now witnessing their unacceptable exclusion. The challenges we face require strong and pragmatic multilateralism. one capable of involving governments, parliaments, and civil society. The summit, the G20 summit of heads of state and government in Rome in late October, will be a unique opportunity to coordinate common and effective responses. And our work will benefit greatly from your discussions, I feel. And I do wish that you have a fruitful meeting, and I am looking forward to reading your conclusions. Thank you.
Grazie, Presidente Draghi.
Thank you, Mr. Draghi, for this very important contribution to our encounter, both as Italian Prime Minister and annual President of the G20. I now give the floor to the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies and Congress of the United States of America, Nancy Pelosi. Madam Pelosi, you have the floor.
Buongiorno. Buongiorno. It's an honor to be here to bring the greetings of the Congress of the United States to this important meeting of the G20 parliamentary leaders, the Summit on People, Planet, and Prosperity. It's a special honor to be here with Prime Minister, His Excellency Mario Draghi. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for your leadership on the coronavirus, on climate, and so many other challenges of our global community. Thank you, President Elisabetta CASELLATI, for your leadership, your hospitality here today, and the wonderful role that you play as a woman and for women as President of the Italian Senate. Speaker FICO, thank you for the invitation to participate in this meeting. Friends, this is the fourth meeting I will be having in recent time with Speaker Fico on the topics of the summit. Our colleague from the UK, Mr. Hoyle, can attest that we've all learned a great deal from him in our meetings. It's always a welcomed opportunity for me to come to Italy to celebrate the firm bonds between our two countries, the United States and Italy, which is rooted in our shared history, values, and interest in global security. And personally, as the first Italian-American Speaker of the House of Representatives, I take special pride in the Italian-American community in America that is a strong link in U.S.-Italy relations. It's a privilege to be with leaders of the Parliament of the G20 and guest countries for this important summit to discuss the greatest challenges of our time and the opportunity to address them. In that spirit, I quote President Biden's words spoken last month at the UN General Assembly. We stand, in my view, at an inflection point in history. Our security, our prosperity, and our very freedoms are interconnected as never before. And so we must work together as never before. And I'll just talk about America for a moment. In the early days of our revolution, in the darkest days of the revolution, a philosopher and patriot, Thomas Paine, said, "The times have found us. The times have found us. The times found them to declare independence, to fight a war and win and establish the American democracy." The times had found them. Nearly 100 years later, the times found Abraham Lincoln to fight and win a war to keep that American democracy as one country. In the next century, in the 20th century, the Second World War broke out around the world. The times found leaders of the free world to become allies to fight evil and make the world safe for liberty and peace. And today, the times have found us, each and every one of us, to save the people from COVID and to save the planet from the existential threat of the climate crisis. Now not that we place ourselves in the category of greatness of those who went before, but we recognize the urgency of the challenge that we face, and we must we must address it. On the climate crisis, many of the parliaments here have long recognized the urgency and have led the way on action. Many of you have done that already. You have faced the reality of the climate crisis in your own countries. We, the G20 countries, are the world's largest polluters, producing, well, maybe up to 75% of the emissions. And we have a responsibility to act. We have a great opportunity to do so. The G720s could mitigate the vast majority of climate change, keeping warming to 1.7 degrees Celsius if we act now, and we must. When our nations meet in Glasgow next month, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the hospitality of your country, Mr. Speaker of the UK, and the cooperation of Italy in the G26, the COP26. When we go there, we must bring our highest ambitions to the table. We must not only meet our Paris goals, we must beat them in order to limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. In America, under President Biden, we have committed to reducing emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030, and we work toward achieving a clean energy economy with net zero emissions by 2050. These are goals that we all share. We must, though, join together to meet this goal around the world. Congratulations to many of your countries who are already taking action to meet these goals. We can certainly learn from you. Working with President Biden, the United States Congress is taking action. We are working on the enactment of the Biden Build Back Better agenda, which contains the most dramatic climate action of any legislation in the history of our country. It would be a dereliction of duty to pass any infrastructure and building legislation that fails to respond to the urgency of the climate crisis. This is about the children, leaving them a world in which they can be healthy, thrive, and reach their fulfillment. It's always about the children, in my view. President Biden, in America, we're proud to have a president who was one of the first leaders in Congress to advance climate action as early as 1986. He brags about that a lot. President Biden respects science and understands the urgency, which is essential also for combating the coronavirus pandemic. 18 months ago, in March 2020, the world watched sadly as Italy experienced the beginning of the worst COVID outbreak in Europe. We pray for every life lost here and in each of our nations, lives taken by this vicious virus. As we do so, we stand united only in grief, but in gratitude for the courage of Italy under Prime Minister Draghi, whose example helped rally the international community to strong, coordinated actions. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And we know that globally, much more needs to be done. Both in all these areas. Nearly 2 years into this pandemic, we know that the most effective way to crush the virus is with safe and effective vaccines. And let me be clear, the Biden administration and U.S. Congress believe that there is no choice between vaccinating Americans and vaccinating the world. We must do both. We can leave no one behind. Under leadership of President Biden, America is delivering more vaccine doses abroad, and we're sending over 1 billion doses to communities and countries around the world, at least 1 billion. Especially as Delta continues, we must work together in this fight. None of us is safe until all of us are safe. I just want to go back to the climate issue for a moment, because as the distinguished Madam President has said, and Speaker Rico has referenced, and Prime Minister as well, this is an issue that we have to have fairness about. equity. It's a justice issue. And as Madam President said, women were affected drastically, economically, in every way during in the course of the pandemic, and still are. So when we are looking at all of this, and we're talking about building back better in America, we're talking about building back better with women. With women, many things that exist in developed countries that we do not have in the United States: child care, early childhood education, family and medical leave, the list goes on, home health care, and the rest. So we are recognizing that over 4 million people women lost their jobs. Only half of them are able to be back into the market, job market, because they need help with their children and other health care providing that they do at home. So we see the role of women. And I thank you both all for the reference to the women in Afghanistan. I wear this ring made by them. We carry them in our hearts, a constant, not that we need a reminder, but a constant flow of influence from them and inspiration from them. It was a wonderful thing that happened for 20 years nearly, of women and girls being educated. But we must always shine the bright light. In a time of COVID, in a time of a climate crisis, there have to be opportunities for these women to succeed. Because this climate crisis it's a priority for us. For me, I believe that this is God's creation and we have a moral responsibility to be good stewards of it. But if you don't even share that religious view, we all agree that we have a moral responsibility to our children to have this planet, hand this planet to them in an important way. It's a health issue. Clean air, clean water, clean water, clean water. We keep emphasizing that for them. It's a jobs issue, an economic issue, good green jobs to bring people in, more people, lift more people into prosperity through these new technologies. It's a national security issue. Security experts tell us that this is a national security issue because we must prevent migration and conflict that stems from the competition for resources and habitat that is engendered by the climate crisis. And then once again, back to moral issue, we have to be good stewards, but we have to do so in a just way, justice for the most vulnerable communities among us, especially in the indigenous communities where we have been hit first, where they have been hit first and hardest. As Speaker FICO said, we will be talking about this more in the days ahead. So again, we have a lot on our plate as we have had these parliamentary meetings from time to time. If you go back a few years, we would not have had COVID, but we do. And we must address it with justice and equity. And if we have for a long time had the climate crisis, some in denial about it, all of us must accept the science and also the governance to deal with it. So again, as Time as Pain has said, the times have found us. We know that it's about time. Everything's about time. The time to crush the virus and save the planet. Thank God for the vaccines and the blessings of science that have brought that to us. Working together, the G20 nations must accept this challenge. We must rise to the urgency of the moment. I have no doubt that we will. And we must advance a better world for the people, for the planet, so that many more people can participate in prosperity. And coming back to the women again, we say in America, when women succeed, America succeeds. You could say that of any country in the world, and you can certainly say that globally. So we have an opportunity to have these discussions. I want to again thank our hosts for their hospitality, Mr. Prime Minister, Madam President, Mr. Speaker. Viva Italia. God bless America, and God bless all of the countries who are participating here today. Thank you so much to share some thoughts of the Congress of the United States.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi, for your very important statement. It gives us so many pointers and food for thought. I now call on the President of the Inter-parliamentary Union, Mr. Duarte PACHECO.
Honorable President CASELLATI, President FICO, President Pelosi, Mr. Prime Minister DRAGHI, distinguished speakers of parliament, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It is my great pleasure to join you today at the P20 Speaker Summit. I would like to extend my warm thanks to the Senate and Chamber of Deputies of Italy for hosting this important event, but also for the warm welcome they gave us. Thank you so much, Madam and Mr. Speakers. And, of course, congratulate Italy on its successful G20 presidency. Allow me to say two special words to President Draghi, because President Draghi gave special words of salute to the mission and to the work of IPU, Inter-parliamentary Union, a global organization of parliaments that promote dialogue and understanding between countries and people. Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. And of course, another one to President Pelosi, one example of someone that defends democracy and state of law, also during hard times, especially on moments of hard times. We need courage to stand and defend what we believe. Thank you, Madam Pelosi. Dear colleagues, as representatives of the people, parliamentarians are ideally placed to listen and respond to citizens' concerns and aspirations by providing legal framework and by coordinating the efforts of different stakeholders. Parliaments, therefore, can and should make a substantive contribution to the achievement of the main G20 objectives. With the impact of the pandemic, the challenges we face are increasing, and the uncertainty surrounding our future is becoming greater than ever. COVID-19 devastating impact has shown the fragility of our societies and increased inequality, disparity, discrimination, poverty. In short words, all the evils that we had resolved to address under the banner of Sustainable Development Goals. Dear colleagues, I welcome the structuring of the P20 summit under the 4 Ps, namely people, planet, prosperity, and parliament. I am pleased to note that these topics complement very well the high-level declaration of the 5th World Conference of Speakers of Parliament organized by IPU a few weeks ago in Vienna, and the overall theme of parliamentary leadership for more effective multilateralism that delivers peace and sustainable development for the people and the planet. In the current dense fog of uncertainty, we need to restore hope among our populations. Only with new hope, people can regain a taste for life and dignity. First, we should attack the pressing issue of inequality, especially in the terms of access to treatment in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. It is common knowledge that the vaccine is concentrated in the hands of a teeny minority. This is not just sustainable. No one will be safe from COVID-19 until everyone is safe. So we need to change the situation. But second, we must also find new ways to cooperate in preparation for future pandemics. Remember, dear colleagues, multilateralism is essential to win the war against these enemies. Third, the economic growth is one of the worst in many decades. Only with public investment and support to all who survive will be possible to come back to the growth rate of 2019. The global economy should be guided by a set of fundamental principles, including a free and open market, fairness, no discrimination. And yet, we are witnessing a withdrawal behind national borders through protectionist and populist policies. These have no place in our interconnected and interdependent world. The multilateral trading system, with the World Trade Organization at its core, must emerge stronger than ever. To make this happen, we must redouble our efforts, encourage imagination and innovation, and use our strong sense of responsibility to support global trade and ensure the achievement of sustainable development goals. A key component of the economic recovery will be the digital economy, and the parliaments, of course, must take the lead in efforts to develop core digital knowledge and enhance digital skills among their populations. But we wish not just to recover. We wish a sustainability in our recovery. So it is important to remember that the climate crisis remains the most pressing issue of our times. It is a real existential danger to human health and security. Our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic must be green, inclusive, innovative, sustainable. The forthcoming COP26 meetings in Glasgow will be one essential moment, and a robust parliamentary contribution to that process will be vital to have one ambitious outcome. We trust, believe me, we need to trust that parliamentary meetings that will happen here in Rome during this week and in Glasgow will help build a political moment and bring about a positive outcome for a robust action going forward. Dear colleagues, it is my belief that our discussions here in Rome will help to reinforce our engagement in the G20 process for the well-being of our populations. As far as IPU is concerned, we shall continue to engage and mobilize parliaments around the globe and major international global process and commitments with the aim of further strengthening the parliamentary dimension of global governance. Madam and Mr. Speakers, as you know, you have the power on your hands. Please do not forget it. Please use it to build a better future, and do it right now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you. President PACHECO, for your statement. This statement ends the inaugural and opening session of the P20. After a brief break, we shall reconvene at 12 o'clock noon and start the first thematic session of our meeting. Thank you.
Seats.
Bene, riprendiamo.
We can now resume our activities. Meritxell, BATET, the Speaker of the Congress of Deputies of Spain, will be taking the floor. Thank you very much, President FICO. Distinguished colleagues, welcome back to this session. This is the first of our P20 roundtables, the title of which is Response to the Social and Employment Crisis Caused by the Pandemic. The health crisis brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic is currently being solved in many countries of the world, especially thanks to the scientific progress in the field of vaccination. As you all know, this is a solution that I'd like to underscore three elements of. First of all, is that this is a temporary solution due to two reasons, basically. The first is that we are, of course, expecting new variants, new mutations, new strains of the virus. The second point is that the vaccine has to reach all citizens of all countries of the world if we truly wish to achieve a fully fledged solution and a permanent one. Secondly, the vaccine is a solution which stems from international cooperation. And this proves that individual solutions or national solutions don't have a true reach. And therefore, solutions must be global. The third element I'd like to mention is that this solution was a public solution, one which was supported and developed by public institutions. Therefore, political solutions, and I underscore the word political, is what has led us to the current situation. We have to be able to respond not just to the health crisis, but also to the social and employment crises caused by the pandemic. And to do this, we have to be aware of the deep effects of the crisis that we have experienced and which we continue to experience, unfortunately. International commitment, therefore, shouldn't be limited to the struggle against the virus. It has to extend to the struggle against its consequences by offering capacities and abilities to those countries which don't have the required resources. This is something that the entire international community has to deal with. We all have to guarantee, and not just the countries with a limited amount of resources, we have to guarantee that these solutions aren't short-sighted. We have to work on solving the disadvantages of our neighboring countries, and we have to go beyond that even. This crisis, like every other crisis, also has an effect on the confidence of our citizens, on the cohesion of our societies, which is one of our biggest assets, and it is one of the best tools we have to promote recovery. And therefore, the role of our national parliaments is essential from this point of view. We are the ones, through our representation and through our social and political responsibility, the ones who have to work on rebuilding confidence through consensus that can allow the integration of those citizens who may feel excluded or overlooked due to the current crisis. Therefore, we will be discussing the response to the social and employment crisis caused by the pandemic, with the awareness that there can be no political, ideological, or national approaches. Only through international confidence, only by sharing the experiences of each of our nations, can we succeed in overcoming together from this crisis. And this roundtable will feature a number of experts and distinguished guests that I wish to present to you briefly. We'll be hearing their remarks, and then we'll open a debate. Beginning with Mathias CORMANN, Secretary General of the OECD as of June this year, who will be joining us from Paris. Before being appointed Secretary General of the OECD, Mathias CORMANN was a minister of Australia. He was a senator of the Western Australian state. We will then be giving the floor to Professor Chiara CARROZZA, who is the chair of the National Council for Research of Italy, the first woman to be appointed president of this prestigious institution. Professor CARROZZA is a physicist with a focus on biorobotics, neurorobotics, and bioengineering. Along with her scientific and academic activities, Professor CARROZZA was also a member of the Chamber of Deputies and Minister for Education and Scientific Research. Our third keynote speaker will be Luca VISENTINI, who is Secretary General of the European Trade Union Confederation since 2015. Our fourth speaker will be Valeria RONZITTI, who is Secretary General of SGI Europe since 2012. And she will also be speaking on behalf of BusinessEurope and SME United, an organization of European businesses. And without further ado, let me begin by giving the floor to Mathias CORMANN, OECD Secretary General.
Thank you very much. Dear speakers of Parliament, distinguished guests, a real pleasure to address this session of the 7th G20 Parliamentary Speakers Summit. I'm delighted to continue the very positive association between the P20 and the OECD Global Parliamentary Network, which began back in 2018 at your inaugural meeting in Buenos Aires. The global economy has been recovering, and it's been recovering faster and more strongly than we anticipated, even just a year ago. Extensive policy support combined with the rapid development of effective vaccines, certainly more rapid than initially anticipated, and also combined with the accelerating digital transformation of our economies, have all contributed to this more optimistic outlook. So in our recent interim economic outlook, we project global GDP to grow by 5.7% this year and 4.5% next year. However, the recovery remains uneven across countries and sectors. Countries face different challenges with jobs and incomes short of the levels expected before the pandemic. Across the OECD, there's still over 5.5 million more people unemployed than before the crisis as of September 2021. And despite a strong economic rebound, pre-pandemic levels of employment in the OECD will not be reached before 2023, according to our current projections. And the crisis has hit vulnerable groups, young people, many women, low-skilled workers, frontline workers, harder than others. Young workers, for example, saw large reductions in their hours of work, nearly twice as much as for prime-aged and older workers at the peak of the crisis in 2020. And the crisis has also accelerated structural changes in labour markets on the back of digitalisation, globalisation, of our economies, population aging, and of course, the impact of climate change. Evidence in our 2021 OECD employment outlook suggests that jobs that declined the most when you look at online job postings are also those most exposed to automation and demographic aging. So ensuring a sustained and widespread recovery will require action on a number of fronts. First of all, priority number 1, 2, and 3, we need to get as many people around the world vaccinated as quickly as possible, as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. We also need to provide the right incentives to boost growth in jobs and firms with a viable future in this new post-COVID environment. The recovery plans that governments are rolling out present a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to address key structural issues so as to prepare for a stronger, more resilient future of work for all. So let me touch just on 3 priority areas. The first priority must be connecting people to jobs, which involves supporting job creation, of course, with incentives for business to invest in their future growth and success, but also providing targeted and temporary hiring subsidies and helping startups and young firms grow and find talents and the skills they need. But it also involves expanding active labour market policies to quickly connect job seekers to available jobs. Second priority area is investing in effective skills policies to help businesses, startups and workers transition to occupations and sectors with high growth potential. All efforts should be made to promote lifelong learning and link training to individuals rather than jobs. And thirdly, the third priority area is to address long-standing gaps in social protection. Emergency support for the self-employed put in place by many countries during the crisis should now be reassessed and translated into more targeted and structural responses capable of ensuring both fairness and incentives to work. The OECD is deeply committed to advancing the social agenda, in particular through our long-standing partnership with the G20. This year, working with the Italian G20 presidency, we've been proud to support the design of the G20 roadmap towards and beyond the Brisbane target to promote women's labour market participation and quality jobs. Importantly, we have made crucial progress in international tax policy to address the challenges arising from the digital transformation and globalization. Tomorrow, the OECD G20 inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting will meet to hopefully finalize the agreement and the implementation plan of the 2-pillar solution, which is designed to make our international tax arrangements fairer and work better in the context of a globalized and digitalized world economy. The agreement will provide additional funding to help optimize the strength and the quality of the recovery, to invest in essential public services and support those most affected by the crisis. Pillar 1 modernizes outdated rules to ensure a fairer distribution of profits and taxing rights among countries with respect to the largest multinational enterprises around the world. It is expected to reallocate taxing rights on more than $100 billion US of profit, expected to be reallocated to market jurisdictions each year. Pillar 2 provides for a globally agreed effective minimum corporate tax rate, which countries can use to protect their tax bases. Its provisions are estimated to generate around $150 billion US in new tax revenues globally per year. This reform will bring stability to the international tax system, provide higher tax certainty, and demonstrate the benefits of enhanced international cooperation. Beyond the political agreement, it will be critical to implement it swiftly. We are at the pointy end of the process, and let's hope that we get there. I'm cautiously optimistic, but we'll see. The implementation plan needs to be ambitious, and commitments must turn into reality for your constituents through concrete domestic legislation and ratifications of a new multilateral tax convention. As speakers of the P20, you and your legislatures will play a key role in bringing the agreement into effect. For this reason, in 2013, our OECD Global Parliamentary Network decided to create a dedicated parliamentary group on tax. For eight years now, we have regularly engaged with parliaments throughout tax negotiations. Going forward, this group will be an important space to exchange on the implementation of the standards emerging from the OECD G20 Inclusive Framework Agreement on BEPS, and I encourage you to join us. Finally, I want to touch on the increasingly urgent challenge of tackling climate change. Addressing climate change effectively and efficiently requires global leadership and strong, globally coordinated action. Recent momentum behind countries' climate commitments is encouraging. However, if we are to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, then ambition and commitments are not enough. We need to turn them into real actions and real outcomes. And so far, insufficient details are available on how countries aim to achieve their announced targets on mitigation, adaptation, and financing. We need better, more comparable data and information on the policies that will drive the transition to net zero, including their impacts on people and communities. At the OECD, our new International Programme for Action on Climate, IPAC, will complement the work of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and help participating countries track and assess their progress against their commitments, and also improve their climate action plans through targeted policy advice and comparable indicators. And to help facilitate an ambitious but internationally more coherent, globally better coordinated approach to the pricing of emissions, we're also launching a new initiative to support a better understanding of both explicit and implicit carbon pricing efforts, building on our experience of the inclusive framework that has been pursuing international tax reform. Our aim is to help ensure that more ambitious action on climate change can be pursued in a way that is both effective and fair. Effective in that it leads to a reduction in global emissions instead of just shifting emissions to other parts of the world, and fair in that every country carries a fair and appropriate share of the burden. Recognizing a diversity of policy approaches to cater for a diversity of circumstances around the world, the challenge is to ensure that the necessary lifting in ambition and effort does not lead to negative and counterproductive distortions, from competitiveness implications to carbon leakage to trade tensions. Indeed, it's about how best to preserve a global level playing field while lifting ambition and effort on climate to the level required through an appropriately comprehensive, coherent global approach. To achieve this, our proposed initiative will assess and report on explicit and implicit carbon pricing efforts around the world as a way to inform such a more coherent, globally coordinated way forward. Parliaments will have an important role to play in the implementation of national climate strategies, and I look forward to hearing the outcome of your discussions in the next session, Rebooting Economic Growth in terms of social and environmental sustainability. Colleagues, we need to optimize the strength and the quality of the recovery. We need to tackle climate change. We need to seize the opportunities while better managing the risks associated with the accelerating digital transformation of our economies. We need to finalize the agreement on international tax reform to make international tax arrangements fairer and work better in a digitalized, globalized world. And we will need to reform our rules-based trading system to ensure we can have a well-functioning global market. And we need to continue to pursue reforms to advance gender equality, social mobility, and more generally, equality of opportunity. To succeed, we need you as parliamentarians to make these policy goals a reality for the people you serve. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor CORMANN. Gracias por...
Thank you, Mr. CORMANN. Thank you for explaining the OECD's commitment in the struggle against climate change and with its social agenda, with a specific focus on gender equality. And, of course, as far as the young people of our countries are concerned, we are aware of the fact that you have other institutional commitments, and we know you won't be able to stay with us until the end of the session. Thank you very much indeed, and all the best in your important work in the international organization you're the Secretary General of. Professor CARROZZA has the floor now.
Signora Presidente.
Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, colleagues, authorities, At this time of global emergency, the attention of the media and each and every one of us has been focused on a number of very special themes that are very much linked to the spread and fight against the pandemic. And they're more or less directly linked to individual freedoms, social relationships, political and institutional relationships, and issues of an economic and financial nature. After overcome the more acute phases of the pandemic, and thanks to all the efforts made in translational research and stepping up, experimenting on treatment and vaccines against COVID-19, the attention of people is now more focusing on an effort to analyze matters within a more historical context and with new perspectives, strengthening our awareness that we are living in a global environment where everything is linked together, an ecosystem in an unstable balance where it is important to program and foresee the impact of individual behaviors and certain specific matters relating to the planet. New grammars, new alphabets are rewriting the narration of human relations, supporting our globalized world outside the enclosures and paradigms of culture that are defined by the term modernity. In digital transition, the contrast between reality and imagination, which is linked in neurosciences by the link between perception and action, will be re-questioned in the relationship between the local and virtual, the here and now, and the presence within the web, within a network that is not defined in time, that cannot be deleted, is present everywhere. A humanity that to come to grips with precarious relations, precarious affects, hermeneutics, culture, and economics. Everything is precarious. Bauman's image tells us that relationships are fluid in a world where the representation of reality seems to be more real than reality itself. We're thinking about the two crises linked to climate change and the pandemic, and science has two tasks: reading reality through measures and models and their interpretation in a predictive approach. In parliaments, and I was a member of Italian parliament, needs to develop science evidence-based laws and also focus on our common well-being. This should be our north, and it is the mission of humankind. We need to look at the deeply integrated relations between science, society, and politics. In a geopolitical framework, we must look at a stronger scientific diplomacy, especially when it comes to access to treatment, sustainability, use of resources, and fight against climate change. It is more and more clear that the balance in our ecosystem can only be achieved through fairness and the fight against inequality and everything that has to do with fundamental research in education, competence, infrastructural ability to transform science into technology, to organizing translational experimentation with a rigorous method which is respectful of ethic principle, guaranteeing its spread and accessibility. I believe that we need to look at the spirit of the Russell-Einstein Manifest of 1955 that invites all sciences of the world to come together to discuss the risks to humanity of the atomic weapons. And really, we must recall the phrase of Joseph Rotblat, the atomic physicist who, presenting the manifest, said, "Remember your humanity and forget everything else." During the pandemic, this has become more and more important. We need to look at investments And we need to use innovation as a catalyst, developing instruments that are more adapted to supporting public-private partnership, and also meeting the challenge of improving translational research and step it up. There is a growing awareness, there is collective awareness that scientific research can help reach peace, harmonious and integral development, and also a fundamental element for the future of the planet and those who inhabit it. Climate change has been a warning cry, and it is urgent, inexorable, and here we have international science that calls us to biological balance, sustainability, and biodiversity. We need to look into a new industrial revolution, change its form from linear to circular, from a revolution which was devastating to the environment, and turn it into an industrial development which is productive of balance in the environment, doing away with waste. We need to develop science skills for a green revolution, for a sustainable digital transition, for a use of resources that is not indefinite but linked to a balance which is not only geopolitical but also biological, that protects biodiversity and impact on the environment. Doubtless, the two crises, pandemic and climate change, have contributed structurally to define the epochal change announced and discussed in public debate in recent years. At this point in time, humanity has survival at stake, but it also has as its objective digital and green transition that represent important goals. In history, industrial revolution has seen the environment as something that came after everything else. Now, upsetting this paradigm calls for a scientific and technological revolution. Certainly, we know where we want to go, but we really don't have all the skills and knowledge and infrastructures to achieve these goals. We are in a ground where we need to write our history and need to find in science our mission to contribute to saving the planet in an equitable and accessible fashion. Another element is the measurable reality and the structural elements therein. We have so many recent scientific acquisitions that show us that life develops on the ability to relate and not an isolation. And therefore, we need to move towards a concept of the infinite. If we only analyze surface and the primary condition of living together in the current world, war and peace, we find ourselves in a time which is fluid and uncertain. We've gone from great divisions to great fragmentation after decades in which man and politics have ignored the consequences of anthropic action on nature. We are faced with devastating atmospheric phenomena. Europe and its historic identity need to go back to being a privileged laboratory for civilization and humanism that have influenced the history of humanity for over 2 millenniums. We need to achieve liberty, equality, fraternity, that come together in the principle of research and truth. These crises we're living remind us the need from now onwards to value situations, problems, and the choices that give us their priority approaches and models and languages that are less abstract and ideological. We need to look at concrete needs. It's not just technology, but we have to aim for, but also the environment, the ecology, and really, we need to look at culture, society, politics, and the economy. The links between human rights and digital economy call for appropriate laws, especially at the supranational level, to lay down norms to deal with resources, guarantee freedoms, and especially fairness. A response to social and employment crisis caused by the pandemic is a great phenomenon. We will have to apply and use artificial intelligence, but not only to come to a fourth industrial revolution, but to provide goods and services. And this will have the effect of leading to a great cultural change, a new political dimension. And this is paradigmatic of what technology and science can provide. But everything needs to be geared to sustainable development in an approach that is no longer linked to the possession of technology in itself. There is a situation of great evolution, and it is a great potential for human development, but it can lead to an injustice, inequality, exploitation, and therefore it is necessary to establish ethical grounds and really norms and laws inspired by the principles of equality which should be based on the guarantee of access to technological development, such as vaccines for all, without any distinction of geographical location or societal position or economic situation. Technology is a force for good, and it must be based on ethical values to be such. The link between the world of research and politics needs to provide for mutual recognition and the service to the good of society in a framework of justice to attain a sustainable development that can lead to human salvation. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, profesora CARROZZA, por su...
Thank you very much, Professor CARROZZA, for your important presentation. I'd like to give the floor now to Secretary General VISENTINI.
Onorevoli Presidenti,
Honorable Presidents CASELLATI and FICO, President BATET,
members of Parliament, it's a great pleasure to have the possibility today, on behalf of the European and global trade union movement, to address your conference. And I would like really to thank very much Presidents CASELLATI and FICO for having given the opportunity to the social partners to participate in this initiative. This is, I think, a quite unprecedented initiative, so really thank you very much for the attention that you have decided to give to the social partners, because it's clear that we try our best to play a proactive and positive role in addressing the crisis that we are all facing. And the link between what we are doing as social partners and the work that parliaments are delivering in each and every country of the world, and particularly in the G20 area, is really essential. By the way, our members, trade union and employers' organizations members in the different countries, are always in strict contact with the parliaments to try to cooperate for the best of people. I would like to address four main challenges when it comes to the employment and social crisis that you have put at the core of this first panel for discussion today. The first one is the health and safety of people, and of course, from the point of view of the trade unions, the health and safety of workers. We had three missions to deliver during the pandemic, and also now that we are slowly getting out from the pandemic. The first one was to protect those workers everywhere in the world that were in the front line and that were still delivering services, assistance and activity to the population in each and every country. Those people died more than others, and they had to be protected. The second mission was to protect those that were working from remote, that were suspended from jobs. It can seem as a less important task, but at the same time we have to consider that protecting wages, working conditions when people are working from home, it's also a huge challenge. And the third mission that we are going to deliver now is to protect those that are coming back to work and making sure, first of all, that they can still find their job, and second, that they can come back in a protected health and safety environment. To do so, we had, of course, also as social partners to discuss about vaccination. Vaccination, as it was said very clearly by the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi this morning, is the fundamental tool that is in our hands to make sure that we can get out from the pandemic and we can come back to some kind of new normal. And ensuring universal access free of charge to vaccination for everybody in the world is really an enormous task for all of us. In the rich countries, of course, but especially in the poor countries where the level of vaccination is still so low. And I want to be explicit here. Without waiving the patents, at least temporarily, without increasing the technological capacity of the developing countries, without increasing the capacity for production of vaccines everywhere in the world, we cannot sort it out. It's not only through the charity from the rich countries towards the poor countries that we can resolve the problem of spreading the vaccines everywhere. And we have also to make sure that when workers come back to work, they are not discriminated when it comes to vaccines and when it comes to the conditions for a safe access to their workplace. And we have also to address the return to work to make sure that we can really strengthen our health and public services that were not resilient during this pandemic. And they were not resilient because they were hugely affected by the previous policies of austerity and cuts that we have faced during and after the financial and economic crisis that precede the pandemic. The second element I would like to address is quality jobs. They have been mentioned by Mr. CORMANN a few minutes ago. Just in the European Union, the data that I know best, during the pandemic, the level of unemployment went up to 23 million people. But even more importantly, the number of people that were suspended from their jobs were more than 40 million. And we are struggling to make sure that these people can come back to work finding still their jobs. We are struggling to make sure that we can create the number of jobs that are necessary to make sure that also those that are in unemployment can find an opportunity. In this respect, the job protection measures that all G20 countries in a way or the other have put in place were very important and essential to save the jobs. But at the same time now we have to discuss how we can create more jobs. And in this respect, I'm really convinced that we cannot just come back to business as usual. We cannot just repeat the mistakes that we made in the past, because we cannot forget that after the economic and financial crisis, the recovery was a jobless recovery. Very few numbers of jobs were created, and people were still in a situation of inequality and social exclusion. So this time we cannot repeat the austerity recipes. These are wrong, didn't work. We have to change our economic paradigm in a way that the economy is back at the service of people and not just at the service of profits. This requires, of course, massive investment plans for quality job creation everywhere in each and every country, but this requires also making public debts sustainable in each and every country through forms of multilateral mutualization of this debt. And this requires also reform of the fiscal rules and the budgetary rules that the different governments have to face in the different countries. It means also introducing fair taxation everywhere in the world. Mr. CORMANN already mentioned this. It means also rules for multinational companies. It means also fair rules for international trade. It means, of course, also incentivizing job creation for businesses, but we have also to make sure that when public money goes to the businesses, we can measure the number of jobs they will create with that money. We cannot just spend public money for businesses that use that money to redistribute profits. This is something that we cannot accept. If we do all that, we can really address inequalities. Addressing inequalities cannot stay just as a slogan. We have to be serious and consistent in this respect, and fair redistribution of wealth among workers and citizens is a fundamental element to achieve equality in the labour markets and in the society. In this respect, minimum wages and collective bargaining are a key element. The third challenge, probably the most important one at the moment, is the one about just transition. We are all in support of the targets for addressing climate change that has been established in the Paris Agreement. We are all committed to achieve these targets. We are all committed to introduce new technologies in our economies everywhere. And we, as the trade unions, have created a long time ago a slogan that is, there are no jobs on a dead planet. So it's fundamental also for the trade union movement to address this challenge. And it's also important, of course, to implement the other slogan that is very crucial: nobody has to be left behind. But how can we make it real and not just a slogan, not just words on a paper or in our speeches? How can we manage climate and digital change in a way that the unavoidable job disruption that will come from this phenomena, with millions of jobs that will disappear, will be compensated by millions of jobs that have to be created? This means just transition. And we cannot just stick to the old recipe of ex post compensation approach. What do I mean with that? I mean that we, of course, have to offer training and social protection to workers that are affected by climate change, but this is not enough. We cannot repeat again the mistakes of the past by offering just training pads, pre-retirement schemes, or endless assistance, public assistance, to those that have lost their jobs. This has created in many, many communities just and only economic and social deserts. This is not the approach we can repeat. We need an approach that is based on anticipation of change. That means investment for job creation in the same communities where the jobs are going to be disrupted. That means economic governance, but also social dialogue and social governance. It means that we can offer training and social protection when we can really offer a job. Last but not least, the final challenge from our point of view is how to build a new social contract. This has been explained very well by the United Nations through the Agenda 2030, by the ILO, more recently in the occasion of the 100th anniversary of this institution. A new social contract at global level is essential to address all these challenges. We didn't have it during the globalization crisis, during the financial crisis. We had just austerity, and social protection systems and rights were used as the only macroeconomic stabilizer to compensate the crisis. Now we have to change this. We have to make sure that social protection funds exist in each and every country, universal coverage and adequate benefits. We need to make sure that we can fight against poverty, discrimination and social exclusion. We have to protect rights, extend these rights to those that don't enjoy the same rights as the others, particularly the new forms of work, and implement finally progressive reforms and not just regressive reforms. Also, an element that has to be considered is how to create macroeconomic stabilizers that can protect employment and address unemployment, and this means implementing fully the Agenda 2030. To conclude, honourable members and speakers of the Parliament, if we do all this, we can go out from this crisis better than how we enter it. And social and employment, because social and employment crises lead to authoritarianism. And this is the reason why all our democracies are at risk and under attack at the moment. When people don't see a perspective for the future, where they cannot get a job, where they cannot get inclusion in the society, in the labour market, is when exactly authoritarianism prevails on democracy. To do all this, to defend democracy through employment and social strategies requires ambitious policies and also political will, and it has to happen from our point of view also through social dialogue. The role of parliaments everywhere that are the place of democracy is fundamental in this respect. Make your voices heard. Have an influence on your governments. We will be your allies. We will be on your side to win this battle together. Thank you very much again for having us here. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, secretario general. Efectivamente, el diálogo y el acuerdo sobre...
Thank you. Of course, economic growth and social and environmental stability are essential, especially in defense of democracy, as you just said. I shall now give the floor to the Secretary General, Ms. RONZITTI.
Thank you very much. I hope that's high enough. Yes. So, President CASELLATI, President FICO, President PACHECO, it's my turn to thank you for the invitation. It's not a formal thank you. It's a thank you that is warm-hearted, and it comes from an Italian citizen by origin to congratulate the Italian presidency of the G20 for the real effort and achievement you made to bring the international community together and put on the agenda issues that are particularly important also for the organization I represent, such as healthcare and women, gender equality, but also is a honest thank you for the reason my colleague from the trade union explained. As far as we know, it's the first time that the European social partners are invited to a P20, and I think this is a very topical moment to do so, because we have been fighting in our respective organization to make sure that the COVID-19 crisis was not also becoming a crisis of democracy. And indeed, our members have access to their national parliaments, but not all of them at the same way, the same strength. You know, they don't have the open door that in some countries is there, in some countries is not. So the rule of law issue is very much also at the core of our preoccupation, and that is why the invitation today is particularly important and not only symbolic. I'm here representing all employers' organizations at the European level, not only SGI Europe, of which I'm Secretary General, but also Business Europe and SME United. As you can guess from the name, Business Europe represents the core industry, the private business. SME United represent what, at least in Europe, is the core model for economic reality, the small and medium-sized enterprise. 80% of companies at European level are of a small or a medium size. So it's not easy for me to have a unique speech and language for three organizations that are pretty different among themselves because of the different services and model we provide. However, despite this different approach we might have, I want to start with the similarities, because as employers, we do indeed face similar challenges. We all face labor and skill shortages for completely different reasons. In the private sector, the industry had problems to get people to go for the production of the European industry that did show all its weaknesses during the hard point of the pandemic. In my case, my members were struggling to find new nurses and doctors and had to oblige those who were in hospitals to incredible shift because there was not enough people to care for those in the emergency room. Then we all need, as employers, a pretty quick shift from short-time work schemes to more sound active labor market policies to promote adaptability and employability of workers. Linked to that, we also need to improve the provision of education and training, so to prepare our respective workers for the digital and green transition. And on this, I would like to say that green and digital transition seems to be quite the fashionable buzzword in Brussels at the moment, but those are transitions that were there much before the pandemic and the crisis that we are living in. The COVID-19 was just an accelerator of this crisis, and as employers and workers not to be prepared to face them, it shows that some of the infrastructure around us was not complete and ready. And this brings me is a nice assist to show you what are the differences between our three organizations. Whereas my Business Europe and SME United colleague have an interpretation of the three Ps, people, planet, and prosperity, as a building back better that we, of course, do share. In our case, services of general interest think that we can only go through and learn from this pandemic with a totally new paradigm. I will tell you what are the ingredients of this new paradigm, but before doing so, I think that numbers are the best way to explain it. Recently, at European level, the European Commission did publish what is called Foresight Report. So we try to prepare for the future ahead. And this Foresight Report says that by 2050, there will be a heavy redistribution of global power with a geoeconomic center gravity shifting eastwards. Currently, G7 countries represent around 40% of global GDP, and the economic weight of the emerging seven, part of which is represented today, equates to around 2/3 of the G7s. So this ratio will be completely reversed by 2050. And that is why, I mean, these are huge global change that call for rethinking and go for this new paradigm. It's not surprising that representing services of general interest, being physical infrastructure like water, transport, energy provision, or social infrastructure, healthcare, care, education, public administration, we think that this new paradigm needs to be built on strong social and physical infrastructure, which should be seen as the backbone of growth and prosperity. We have to shift to think of them as a cost, from a cost to an investment. And unfortunately, the lack of resilience of several member states in facing the COVID-19 pandemic is a result of not having seen those social infrastructure as an investment for the future and having gone for short-term cuts. Then we need, and the two things are absolutely linked in our view, a new integrated approach on measuring GDP. We have to go beyond the simple concept of GDP. We have to embrace the concept of well-being. Without that, we are not going to be able to go for this new paradigm. And if you look at the way even OECD measures GDP, you see the limit of it. There is, for instance, in the calculation, no indicator about access to quality services. And that is why this is a very concrete demand that we are making, that in this welfare calculation, access to quality services is counted. And then, and this my colleague from the trade union side already mentioned it, at least at European level, we think that we need a complete rethinking of EU fiscal policy and economic governance. With today, fiscal infrastructure and economic governance at European level, we surely can't embrace this concept of well-being beyond GDP. We like in our organization to say that we don't need any more SGP, Stability and Growth Pact, as it is today. We need a Sustainability and Growth Pact, and that is why we are going to work hard at European level for a rethinking in this sense. President Draghi, who intervened this morning, is one of the first that spoke about the good debt, separating the good debt for education and research and infrastructure from the bad debt that only look for the current expenditure. I would also like, however, to give you a sense of what we as social partners are doing, because otherwise, and I am teasing my colleague from the trade union, we always appear as those who ask, and don't do concretely, but we also do concretely. And an example to give life to what I just said about the importance of ensure the employability of our respective members, but as employers of our workers, I want to pay tribute to an agreement that we recently concluded on the digitalization of the workforce, and the fact that very likely, I hope so, we are going to sit on the table very soon to conclude on an agreement on just transition. So how concretely employers and workers will enable their own people to face the transition being a just transition. And then I would like to conclude with what I started with, the importance of Parliament, because half, if not the two-thirds of what I said is going to be your responsibility to check that is coming real. In our institutional setting, we always have, we speak mainly with government. Our tripartite system of dialogue make it that we often only relate with government, and we don't have access to you, the Parliament, who sometimes is not, if not always, have the courage to embrace this change. And so we have to count on you to monitor that all the measures we need are going to be really implemented. I will conclude with an example, which is the recovery and resilience plans at European level, but any recovery plan at the global level. Government can write and state, but you are going to be the guarantor that this is going to happen on a concrete and democratic manner at your respective levels. So thank you for being there. And I hope this is just the first of a long journey we can do together in this setting. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Secretaria General. Efectivamente, los parlamentos.
Thank you, Secretary General. Of course, public institutions, parliaments have great responsibility, but also we need to count on the representatives of labor organization. And so we need this for a recovery, working all together. So we have finished now with the keynote speakers, but before I open the discussion, I would like to remind everyone of the debate rules. The requests to speak have already been collected, and as you know, we shall follow the alphabetical order of the countries in English. Member states shall take the floor first, followed by P20 guest countries. In order to allow everyone to speak, it is absolutely paramount to respect the 5-minute time limit for each intervention. Better if you speak for 3 minutes rather than 5, but in any event, not more than 5. And then once the interventions are over, there will be a few minutes for possible replies by the 3 wonderful keynote speakers we have just heard, who give us a great deal of food for thought and a basis for our discussion. The first to speak is Mr. Arthur Lira, Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies of Brazil. Madam Speaker of the Senate of the Republic, Mr. President of the Chamber of Deputies of Italy, Mr. President of the Inter-parliamentary Union, fellow parliamentarians, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to start by thanking the Parliament of Italy for its hospitality and leadership in convening this summit of an extraordinary importance at this critical juncture in which the countries and parliaments of the world are fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic, and in an effort to curb the ensuing impacts and in sorrow for the losses, this opportunity for dialogue strengthens our belief that the victory of the current challenges is associated with the cooperation among nations. There are serious health crises that have created unprecedented obstacles for us to fulfill our parliamentarian functions. However, parliaments prove even more necessary in situations of increased instability. For this reason, when Brazil was called to action as the new coronavirus arrived in the country, the Chamber of Deputies took a decisive step to really work as a Chamber of Deputies and take a decisive step with resolve to provide legislation and resources to sustain our national response. Other equally relevant functions are overseeing the response of the government to the crisis, evaluating its actions, and informing the population, thus building a climate of calm and trust among all. The Chamber of Deputies, in the first days following the declaration of the pandemic by the World Health Organization, established a system for remote sessions which allowed the House to work without any delay with virtual deliberations and remote vote by the representatives in hybrid plenary sessions broadcast in real time through different medias. Thanks to this swift adaptation, the Chamber was able to pass already in February 2020 the law equipped the government with instruments to face the health emergency caused by the new coronavirus, including health and administrative measures. We also try to improve the availability of medicines and looked at the availability of supplements and medicines and vaccines. In March 2020, we also approved special fiscal rules which would be more flexible in order to allow for a more adequate mobilization of expenditures as required by the emergency situation. We also set up so-called war budget to be used as a response to COVID-19. The new budgetary rules open the way for the approval of more than $100 billion in additional expenditure in 2020 for health, emergency allowances for the most vulnerable population, and also to support businesses. According to the International Monetary Fund, among a total of 58 economies, Brazil ranked 15th in terms of additional expenditure as a proportion of the GDP. The country mobilized 9.2% of its GDP in response to the health and socioeconomic crisis. The Brazilian parliament has stepped up its efforts in the area of stability. And they were over half of the additional expenditures benefiting 65 million people, being responsible to counter the deterioration of the poverty situation in that period. Cognizant of how important it is to protect the workers threatened by the crisis, we approved the emergency benefit to preserve the employment and income paid by the federal government, an initiative that was to benefit 9.8 million Brazilian workers. In the light of the shortcomings affecting employers, the Parliament also approved a credit line for payroll with a lower interest rate for businesses, which protected employment. This initiative reached 131,000 companies and benefited 2.6 million employees. The Brazilian Parliament has been having a decisive stance in establishing the norms to respond to the challenges posed by the pandemic. The Chamber of Deputies has passed approximately 100 different COVID-19 related norms. Currently, over 1,000 bills on the matter are under discussion. As to the parliamentary roles of oversight and information, we wish to underline, in the context of the Chamber of Deputies, the work of the Committee on Preventive Actions of Health Surveillance and Possible Impacts on Brazil from the COVID-19 pandemic. And also we established a Committee on Social Security and the Family. With the progress in the immunization in Brazil, hope is rising in looking into the future. Facing challenges such as unemployment, inflation, food insecurity, education deficit, and the threat of extreme poverty, the Brazilian Parliament is thinking about instruments to improve the living conditions of our population by promoting sustainable policies that seek economic growth and social justice. And therefore, we are also acting on fiscal matters. And now I give the floor to Mr. Li Zhuanzu of the permanent representation of the Chinese people. And this will be a remote connection.
Maria CASELLATI, President of the Italian Senate. Your Excellency Roberto FICO, President of the Italian Chamber of Deputies. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to attend this G20 Parliamentary Speakers Summit virtually. On behalf of the Chinese side, I wish to thank Italy for its meticulous arrangements for this meeting. Right now, COVID-19 continues to spread and resurge. It has compounded the impacts of changes unseen in a century, and the world has entered a period of new turbulence and transformation. International and regional hotspots keep emerging. Economic recoveries are diverging. And climate change, food crisis, and other non-traditional security issues are posing serious threats. The global challenges we face are unprecedented. It is therefore timely that this meeting chooses people as its primary thematic word. Facing the new circumstances and challenges, we, the legislative bodies of G20 countries, should and must give better play to our unique, crucial role in upholding the people-first philosophy and in helping resolve major global economic and social issues. We must fight COVID-19 with solidarity and science-based approach. The pandemic is the common enemy of people of all countries. We should follow a life-first principle and care for the life, value, and dignity of each and everyone. We need to promote international cooperation in such areas as COVID-19 response, key supplies, and public health. We should truly make vaccines a global public good and raise the accessibility and affordability of vaccines. China has provided more than 1.4 billion doses of vaccines to more than 100 countries and international organizations, and will strive to provide a total of 2 billion doses of vaccines to the world by the end of this year. We must firmly oppose such practices as putting politics above science and vaccine nationalism. We must pursue global development that is robust, green, and healthy. Development holds the key to people's well-being. 2 weeks ago, President Xi Jinping put forward a global development initiative at the UN General Assembly, stressing the importance to follow a people-centered approach and make sure that development is for the people and by the people, and that its fruits are shared among the people. To this end, we should stay committed to development as a priority, to benefits for all, and to innovation-driven development, and strive for high-quality recovery of the world economy. We should actively respond to climate change to achieve harmony between man and nature. We should accelerate implementation of the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and build a global community of development with a shared future. We must uphold true multilateralism and improve the global governance system. Our world is moving toward greater multipolarity, economic globalization, IT application, and cultural diversity. This requires us to view humanity as a community with a shared future, adopt the principles of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits in global governance, and stick to the common values of humanity, namely peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom. We should uphold the UN-centered international system, uphold the international order underpinned by international law, and uphold the multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core. We should strengthen coordination of macroeconomic policies and work toward an open world economy. Colleagues, this year marks the centenary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. The CPC has always adhered to the people first principle in its governance. China has completed the building of a moderately prosperous society in all respects as scheduled, bringing about a historic end to absolute poverty in China. We're now marching toward the goal of building China into a great modern socialist country in all respects. China will continue to provide new opportunities to the world through the new development of itself. The National People's Congress of China is ready to enhance exchanges in cooperation with parliaments of all countries. Let us work together in solidarity to effectively meet the various challenges and jointly create a bright future for the people of all countries. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much, President Sanshu. Now let's give the floor to Mustafa Çentop, President of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey.
Esteemed speakers of the Parliament, distinguished members of the Parliament, and valuable participants, as the Speaker of the Turkish Grand National Assembly, first and foremost, I'd like to thank Italy for its successful G20 presidency, and the Italian Senate and the House of Representatives for hosting us on the common ground of Parliaments for People, Planet, and Prosperity in this critical period in which our world is in, and I'd like to greet you all with the most heartfelt sentiments. We attach importance to the fact that the G20 exhibits the expected leadership in the face of the epidemic-induced crisis we are facing. In the last 30 years, our world has witnessed many global crises, such as the 2008 financial crisis, as well as many regional ones. However, none of these had a devastating impact on countries and societies as the COVID-19 pandemic, which took the lives of around 5 million people. We are aware of the fact that the crisis we try to overcome doesn't consist of only one dimension. We deeply felt the effects of the crisis in many areas, such as economy, health, social life, and employment. The COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately caught the humanity off guard. The wrong policy choices in the past and the measures taken by many countries or imposed from outside to deal with the economic crisis have led to the weakening of the health and social security systems. Pandemic took effect in such circumstances. At this point, I'd like to express that as Turkey, we have managed the global pandemic in question without any capacity problems thanks to the large investments we made in the field of health in the last 20 years. During the pandemic, almost all states have taken many measures to protect the health of their citizens, as well as to prevent the formation of pressures that their national health system cannot bear. Temporarily, the states had to resort to strict public health measures such as curfew and lockdowns. Undoubtedly, we have effectively slowed down the pandemic, but the economic life has also been partially interrupted. The resulting recession has led to shortages of resources and disruptions to global investment flows for businesses, workers. I do not think it would be wrong to state that the social and employment dimensions of this crisis were perhaps the most deeply felt by all countries. According to a study conducted by the UN at the end of 2020, and in the worst-case scenario by 2030, 250 million people will be driven into extreme poverty directly due to COVID-19, and the number of extreme poor will rise to over 1 billion globally. The humanity is face-to-face with the crisis that they have never experienced before. Therefore, in targeting the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I think we are on the verge of a historic opportunity to rebalance our economic development with social and environmental needs and to address socio-economic inequalities. Because as Turkey, we believe that in addition to a national vision, a strong sense of ownership and international solidarity and cooperation are inevitable for the realization of aforesaid goals. With this understanding, while we are dealing with the social and employment aspects of the crisis we are facing with, we strengthen our cooperation with other countries and extend our helping hand to them. We are glad that we have provided support, medical equipments being in the first place, to 160 countries from the onset of the pandemic until now. Valuable friends, diseases, pandemics, and also viruses are global in this world where everything becomes global. Therefore, treatments, medications, and vaccines should be global as well. It is not possible to keep one part of the world, for instance Europe or only G20 countries, healthy. If the rest of the world is struggling with disease and pandemic, we will be subject to such diseases and pandemics as well. These challenging times once again showed us how much we are interdependent to each other in terms of our lives, diseases, and our health. We wouldn't be safe if we cannot create a living space for all the world and all the humanity where they can live in peace, harmony, and minimum living standards. We have to think globally. We believe that it is vital to adopt a result-oriented approach that prioritizes the fight against hunger, poverty, and inequalities. And we also believe that this cooperation between our parliaments should be strengthened even further. As you know, the word parliament means the speeches and the place of delivering speeches, but the speeches should translate into deeds, works, and actions, and there should be harmony and cohesion between words and actions. Our world will not be saved by beautiful and bright words, but rather by actions that give the same value to all people and implemented with egalitarian and fair approaches. Actions speak louder than words. Until we act with sincerity and accept that the life of a civilian in Europe and America is of same value with a civilian in Afghanistan who dies as a result of so-called bombing by accident, a better world will not be a reality. Brilliant speeches about democracy resonates well with our ears. However, we should not overlook the fact that the approaches which supports coups and coup plotters will be critically concerning for the future of our world. So as G20 countries, I believe that we have the necessary infrastructure to realize this. I hope that the steps we take as parliaments will be beneficial for all humanity, and I greet you all with respect.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President Chentop. We now give the floor to Hervé Moret, the former president of the for development of the French Senate. Madam President, Mr. President, the pandemic underscores the vulnerability of the world's economy and its bond with the world's climate. The cause of the pandemic is likely linked to the evolution of climate, and also because we were able to observe the fact that the situation of both the pandemic and the economic crisis have had impacts in terms of CO2 emissions. And from this respect, we also noticed that the slowdown of CO2 emissions linked to the pandemic is expected to last to 2030 as a way of limiting the increase in temperature to 1 degree. Therefore, the impact on climate is obvious, and it also shows the consequences of our development model. The crisis also highlighted inequalities between economies because, of course, the most fragile economies are the ones which suffered the most from the point of view of health and in terms of the economic and social points of view. According to the World Trade Organization, millions of jobs have been affected by the pandemic and by the crisis. France swiftly moved to implement policies as a way of curbing the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. This is, in fact, the proposal made by the President of the Republic of France with a view to limit the social and economic consequences of the crisis, especially with support given to those companies which were affected most by the lockdown and by the economic slowdown, especially in the fields of tourism and culture. Thanks to these policies, we were able to curb the consequences of the crisis, although it obviously had major costs equal to roughly 240 billion euros, with plenty of subsidies, which obviously also had an impact on the increase of our debt, which grew by 230 billion euros in France. According to the government's estimates, we will need some 20 years in order to pay back this debt. I'd like to insist on the fact that the measures which have been implemented due to the specific situation were also completed by an extremely important recovery plan, which is now up to 100 billion euros, with which we were able to strengthen the competitiveness of our enterprises, with also major impacts from the social and territorial points of view, with funding for our healthcare system, for young people, and for local territories. Local territories and local communities, in fact, have had a major role to play in managing the pandemic and its consequences. We were able to implement healthcare measures also thanks to the support of regions and municipalities. The French Recovery Plan also focuses on ecology. France is one of the most important decarbonized economies with a very ambitious plan. And it is also very important for our economic recovery to support the environment through a transition phase. And the OECD has studied all of the recovery plans for all member states, and it found a number of positive and negative elements in the national resilience and recovery plans for all OECD countries. Some of the national plans don't even mention the environment in their national plans, and therefore there is still a great deal of work to do. Europe has had an important role to play in supporting the recovery plans of its economies, thanks to the major funds made available, equal to 800 billion euros, which go on top of the European budget. Another important element was the cooperation of countries within the framework of the G20. We were able to manage a financial crisis in the 1990s, whereas now we have to manage another crisis. It is an unprecedented one, and it is important for parliaments to be focused on the resilience of the economy. And therefore, as members of parliament, we have an important role to play. Let me conclude by thanking the Italian presidency of the G20 for having focused on the climate dimension in its agenda. It is something new, and it is very important to have discussions on the climate within the G20. It is important to make sure that our planet is among the G20's targets, because, once again, the response to the economic and social crisis should not happen to the detriment of the climate. This is a moment in time in which we have to focus specifically on those policies that can help us promote the ecological transition and the protection of our climate. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Moret. I'd now like to give the floor to Om Birla, who is the president of the Chamber of the People of the Hindu Parliament.
Honorable chairpersons and delegates, friends, COVID-19 pandemic has caused an unprecedented crisis worldwide. As is the case with other countries, this pandemic has adversely affected the low-wage workers and the middle classes in our country as well. This has also created stress in various other sectors of the economy. In order to effectively deal with this pandemic, we have focused on our efforts simultaneously on saving lives and livelihoods. I represent the Republic of India here, where glorious tradition of democracy spans thousands of years. My country has entered into the 75th year of the independence on 5th of August this year. Our rich, diverse, and vibrant democracy is celebrating this as Amrit Mahotsav. Indian Parliament discharged its democratic duties even during the COVID pandemic and passed, inter alia, 4 historic labor laws with objective on enhancing employment, generation of ensuring wage security, social security, and job security for citizens. Under this, the government of India has given special emphasis on reviving the national economy. A special package of 420 billion to strengthen the country's economy is being implemented. The rural economy will be the main beneficiary of this package. 67 million women, members of rural-based self-help groups, are actively working to bolster the rural economy. To increase jobs in rural areas, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has been further expanded. More than 150 million people in our rural areas are being provided employment under this scheme. As a result of environment of good governance and transparency provided by the government, India is now among the top 100 countries in the ease of doing business. I'm confident that we will soon be the top investment destination of the world. Ambitious schemes like National Infrastructure Pipeline have been launched to strengthen the economic base of the country. It will not only boost the economic growth, but also generate employment. You will be pleased to learn that for the first time, 430 million people in India have been directly added to the banking system. Also under the Ayushman Bharat Yojana, medical facilities have been provided to 165 million citizens, free of cost. It is my belief that in order to deal with such global disasters in future, we need to treat the whole world as one family and formulate an integrated and coordinated strategy to deal with the global issues. Parliaments of the world need to work together for this. Our priority should be to formulate developmental policies so that to ensure welfare and sections of the society. Such development policies need to be extensively deliberated and discussed on multilateral platforms with the objective of preparing a suitable and sustainable global roadmap funded on the principle of social and economic justice. This approach will help us in dealing with such global disaster in the future. I urge upon the parliaments of G20 countries to come together for ourselves and our future generation to join hands with a sense of collective responsibility to build a better future for our planet. Thank you.
Cámara de Representantes de Indonesia.
I now call on the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Indonesia.
Distinguished Chair and delegates, first I would like to express my appreciation to President of the Senate and the President of the Chamber of Deputies of Italy for holding this P20 meeting amidst the pandemic. The pandemic has led to humanitarian crisis. In 2020, as many as 255 million people lost their jobs and 125 million people fell back into poverty. There are several things that the P20 can do to alleviate the social burden and create jobs. First, to accelerate the speed of pandemic recovery and the rate of global vaccination. Health response is the key to recovery. According to the WHO, as of today, 5.7 billion vaccines have been administered globally, but there is no equal distribution of vaccine. If this vaccine had been provided equitably to 7.8 billion of the world population, we could achieve a more equal immunity with 73% of the world population receiving their first dose. The world needs a global plan to end the pandemic, including a global vaccination roadmap to achieve fair and equitable vaccine distribution by taking measure of accelerating dose sharing, increasing and diversifying global vaccine manufacturing, supporting technology transfer and waiver of intellectual property rights, eliminating vaccine discrimination. Countries with high vaccination rate tend to demonstrate higher economic growth. In Indonesia, our vaccination rate has achieved more than 150 million administered doses. We expect to achieve 70% of our first dose target before the end of 2021. Second, to drive strong and balanced economic growth in different regions. Positive economic growth will reopen jobs and in turn reduce the rate of unemployment. The IMF projects that world economic growth in 2021 may achieve 6%, but it will be unequal amongst countries. Therefore, the international community needs to coordinate economic policies, both in fiscal and monetary sector. Economic recovery should also be pursued alongside green economy implementation to create a strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. As for Indonesia, in the second half of 2021, our economy grew quite strongly at 7.07%. At the same time, Indonesia has also committed to realize quality and green economic policy. Third, to encourage the international community to support developing countries in addressing social impact of the pandemic, such as rising poverty and inequality. Developed countries still have the resources to lend their support. Recovery packages consist of 20% of GDP in developed countries, while it is only 2% in poor countries. Indonesia, we have allocated $52 billion for the pandemic recovery program in 2021 that helps mitigating social and economic impact of the pandemic. To achieve the above objective, we need the effort to enhance global partnership and strengthen multilateralism. National parliament can influence international position that a country holds and encourage governments to foster global solidarity and mutual trust instead of resorting to unilateral action. Finally, allow me to reiterate that only with global solidarity that we can together end the pandemic and resolve the social and employment crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Maharani. Sigue la intervención de...
He will be followed by Olga Sánchez-Cordero, Speaker of the Senate of Mexico. Thank you very much. My warm greetings to the presidents, speakers, and members of national parliaments of the G20, and I extend my congratulations for being convened to this conference of the P20. The heads of state and government of the 20 most advanced economy of the world recognize the role and power of legislative authorities, and changes have been made to find solutions to the economic, financial, global crisis, starting with the 2013 agenda targets and in the fight against social exclusion and tax evasion. And I welcome this seventh conference of parliaments for prosperity for people, for the planet. On this opportunity, I thank the Italian presidency, and we are also working up towards the summit which will take place here in Italy. We have achieved parity in government and in parliament. After many years of struggles by Mexican women and with the support of MPs. Now, speaking about the efforts of this meeting, we need to think about these important pillars. The pandemic in 2019 led to a health and economic crisis globally, and it was unprecedented. And this had led to a historic reaction and also unemployment and disruption of so many systems. Many countries see the poorest and most vulnerable being especially struck, especially therefore women, youth, girls and boys. These negative impacts can also be intergenerational. Regrettably, this health emergency has been added on to other problems such as poverty, inequality, and conflict. Global crisis and climate change are both advancing fast. The planet is suffering, is seeing the prolonged effects of climate change in economic terms, in undermining the well-being of all of humanity. Complex systems and a lack of plural dialogue on the labor issues caused by the pandemic and the ways to achieve a true resilient growth which is environment friendly, calls for an involvement of all governments, all players in government and society at large. Mexico has called to all nations to be able to have access to medicines and vaccines to be seen as a global public good, and I stress this. The Mexican presidency and the Latin American and Caribbean community of states has stressed the importance of achieving health self-reliance in the region with competitive strengthening and research capacity and development and research into medicines and vaccines. We are also promoting inclusive, sustainable, and resilient involvement and engagement to improve the labor market. And we support the declaration of the labor ministers meeting in Catania. All parliaments should look at a better access of social justice. This is a commitment to achieve better employment and more employment with fair wages. But women must be at the heart of all this. We recognize that in the pandemic, they gave special care to the pandemic, and they were caregivers, and they really bore all of the burden or most of the burden, and this has to change. We need a bill to establish a national system for caregiving to revert the negative effect of this excess burden on women and young girls, inequality in incomes, lack of progress, and inequality of women and children call for a system of care that redistributes the work burden that really lie on the shoulders of women. And these are forms of care that are not remunerated. They are carried out by women, but not only by children, boys and girls. And they harm the economy because they increase the gender inequality. This is something that was engendered by the pandemic, and it promotes violence, inequality. And therefore, it is necessary to work globally to build a new social contract based on new equality paradigms with solidarity involving the state, but also the private sector, communities, and households. It is true that in all the regions of the world, there is a gap between the employment rate of men and women and also wage inequality. And therefore, national system should be based on remunerated care for the empowerment, not only for women. Sorry, President Sanchez, I don't know whether you can hear me, but please could you come to your conclusion because we are a bit short of time. Yes, I shall now conclude. And they generate inequalities, and therefore Mexico through John, the Council of Women, has established caregiving, and this to promote caregiving, remunerated caregiving, not only in the country but worldwide. Thank you. And Petr Tolstoy, Vice President of the Duma of Russia, has the floor.
Президенте, buongiorno, коллеги. Хочу поблагодарить всех за очень содержательный.
I wish to thank all of the previous speakers for a number of very interesting remarks. I think the pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on basically all of the aspects of our economic and social activity. It has affected labor markets in all countries, and even in Russia. The incomes have fallen sharply. Changes to our country's economies have had an impact on almost 7 million people in the Russian Federation. Women and young people have been in extremely difficult situations, and youth employment in G20 countries in 2020 declined by 11%. All of these factors obviously had an impact on labor supply and demand and working conditions, and it has exacerbated inequalities. The labor ministers meeting under the Italian presidency held in June this year I think was an excellent choice made by the G20 towards economic recovery. The topics we touched upon were extremely important. We talked about supporting employment, strengthening social protection systems, equal opportunities for men and women, and changing labor markets in the area of digitization. We know that much is already being done in G20 countries to reform welfare systems, to adapt to new forms of employment. Even in Russia, we focus a great deal on social support issues. And during the pandemic, we implemented a number of further welfare measures for the unemployed. Unemployment benefits were increased. Support measures for our pensioners were introduced and expanded. Funding was given to families with children. And we also had legislation on digitization with the population and occupational safety. Proof of how important welfare issues are around the world is underscored by the ILO's global call to action for human-centered recovery. This initiative by the ILO is supported by G20 countries, including Russia, of course. The human-centered approach is a concept which is in line with Russia's reform agenda, and this affects millions of workers in our country. Russia, with this approach in mind, is lending its support to other countries. In July this year, the ILO praised 2 international programs funded by the Russian Federation, which includes a strategy for professional training, which is currently ongoing. This was approved by G20 countries for a number of countries in Asia and the Middle East. The second program, which was successfully completed, is a joint project between the International Labour Organization and Lukoil, the Lukoil company. The name of this project is the Partnership in Youth Employment of the Commonwealth of Independent States. The program is aimed at improving the effectiveness of policies and programs to provide young people with decent jobs in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The crisis brought about by the pandemic must become an opportunity to change global development and making the world a planet focused on fairness. We are seeing a number of changes which are sustained. Mainstream trends such as the Fourth Industrial Revolution and digitization have intensified. And according to the World Economic Forum report titled The Future of Jobs 2020, by 2025, new technologies will destroy 85 million jobs, creating 97 million new jobs to replace them. Reforms in companies will lead to the need for massive retraining, accelerated automation, and changes in the structure of jobs. Therefore, we require action by the international community. The G20, in Russia's opinion, as the main forum for the world's leading economies, has to focus on the long-term strengthening of effective multilateral cooperation mechanisms without losing sight of the importance of short and medium-term measures. We will continue to support the G20's efforts to curb the disastrous effects of the pandemic on the labor markets. We will work to prevent its impacts on men and women and injustices against the more vulnerable sectors of society as we work towards the promotion of digital and green economies. Thank you.
Spasiba, señor Tolstoy.
Thank you, Mr. Tolstoy. Our final speaker for the roundtable is Nosiviwe Mapisa Nakula, President of the National Assembly of South Africa.
Thank you, Honorable President CASELLATI, President FICO, Honorable Speakers, and all the presiding officers. On the 26th of March last year, Government of South Africa declared that what can be regarded as its first major state of disaster, placing our country on a total lockdown of the economy following reports of the first confirmed cases of COVID-19 infections. Although there were already a few countries, mainly in Europe, who were experiencing these lockdowns, nothing could have prepared us for the true impact the advent of COVID-19 pandemic on our lives as we had known until then. The outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020 found a vulnerable South African economy. In fact, at the time the pandemic reached our shores, the South African economy had experienced 2 consecutive quarters of a recession. As a result, the COVID-19 pandemic deepened the economic crisis. Many people lost their jobs, many have gone without income for extended periods, and many are going hungry every day. Inequality is expected to widen and poverty to deepen. Given the extent of the devastation, the economic response required should match or even surpass the scale of the disruption caused. Now, so the pandemic also had the impact of reversing the gains of the country that which we had already made towards the restructuring of the economy and creating a better life for the disadvantaged, especially women and the youth. This indirectly led to the inability of the country to fulfill some of its own targets towards the sustainable development goals. At a social level, the pandemic and the lockdown created untold emotional and psychological suffering amongst many South Africans. South Africa also saw a rise of another pandemic, the scourge of gender-based violence and femicide, with cases linked directly to psychological impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. There is also concern about the psychological impact of the lockdown has had on children who could no longer attend schooling. The pressure on our health system, public and private, meant that many people were no longer able to receive the much-needed occupational health care, including therapy. Now, it is against this background that in dealing with the economic challenges, that the government decided to release its economic reconstruction and recovery plan in October 2020. But also, this is meant to build a new economy and unleash South Africa's potential, and also create sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy. South Africa has also decided to place the development of the fourth industrial revolution technology at the heart of its recovery rate. As part of the efforts of dealing with the second pandemic of gender-based violence and femicide, the South African government adopted the National Strategic Plan for the Prevention of the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. The National Strategic Plan aims to strengthen a coordinated national response to the crisis of gender-based violence and femicide. Now, as I conclude, I see that this is beeping. As members of Parliament, I think it is important that we, with the devastating efforts on humanity from the socio-economic perspective, we should encourage our parliaments to strengthen oversight function so that the agreements adopted at different multilateral forums are implemented and its effects have a positive impact in saving people's lives, reconstruct and transform our economies to bring about a new global reality post-COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta Mapisa Nakula.
Thank you, President Mathias Makula. And now to conclude this roundtable, allow me to share with you two short messages. Firstly, to underscore the importance of the new agreements within the OECD to have all the necessary resources for an inclusive and balanced development in all countries. We also need a new tax system, which is a global taxing system. And in a time of technology development, robotic and scientific development, it is time to look at humanity, to look at human rights. And thirdly, vaccines, no discrimination, quality of life, it should be extended to all if we want to really recover and not be involved in navel gazing. So really we need a new social contract and achieve the 2020 agenda globally. And fourth, recovery cannot really overlook the challenges that our societies have to deal with, such as climate change. So thank you to the speakers, to all the keynote speakers, and thank you, Speaker FICO, for giving me this opportunity to moderate this important and interesting session, so rich in content. So now we have a break for lunch, and we shall resume at 3. Thank you.